'64, I was working at the track in Vancouver, and I was filling in applications anywhere I could think of to get a steady job. And one of those applications was for the Vancouver Police Department. And of course, you're filling out dozens of these things, and I got a phone call, and they said, "Would you come and write the exam?" Which I did, in shock. I finished in the top 2 or 3 out of 100, I guess. So I was interviewed. They did a background check, obviously not a very good one because they hired me. And on the 28th September '64, I started joining the Vancouver Police, and I didn't know it at the time, but that was the start of an absolutely interesting, entertaining 30 and a half years. Thoroughly enjoyed it, had more fun than anybody should be allowed to have. And of course, now I had to tell the lady that I was working for at the track that I was leaving. So I gave her a couple of weeks' notice, and I was more concerned about the horses than her. So she said, "Well, would more money help?" And I said, No. She said, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "I'm joining the police department." Well, she went absolutely white. And I couldn't figure that out, but we found her another person to do the job. And of course, later on, I found out that she was a woman involved in women's health issues before Dr. Morgenthaler. So she was a nice lady, but that's what she did, apparently. The police training was tough. They had you running miles, and of course I could run the length of a lacrosse floor or basketball court, and that was it. But the rest of it was common sense. I didn't know anything about the police. For example, in Victoria, Saanich, they use names. Vancouver, bigger force, they use numbers. So I got tagged with 356 and carried that for years. My first night out on the job was a midnight shift. And of course I'm assigned to a more senior guy who's going to teach me what I should know. So you walk into the parade room that night in your brand new uniform, and it was just like going back to school again. "Jack, you're the new kid in this group of guys." And they're all kind of looking at you. "Can we trust you to, look after us or our backs or anything else?" So, and that happened for a while. But the first night, I'd been out for about an hour, and I was in East Vancouver. I didn't know the geography, I didn't know the streets. I knew Hastings Street because that went to the racetrack. And that was about the extent of it. So I'm watching the street signs and trying to listen to the radio and watch for bad guys and all kinds of things. And then they broadcast that there was a car chase coming out Venables Street from the Skid Road, and we weren't far away, so we pulled up to the corner of Venables and Clark, and shooting right across the front of us was a brown 54 Ford, never forget it, going like stink. Of course, my partner was pretty eager, so he dropped the clutch on the Chev we had and started. I said, "There's a police car behind him," and he stopped quick, and by went the police, 2 or 3 police cars. We'd all been in the middle of the intersection if I hadn't said anything. He thanked me for it later, instead of telling me to shut up like they did with most kids. That same night, there was the same chase. The dog man was in the West End, and he had the beat man from Robson Street riding around in the car for a little bit of company. I guess his dog was getting on his nerves. He wouldn't stop and let the beat man out. They ended up hitting a farmer's truck, or a farmer's truck hit them at First and Clark. He's lying there in the middle of the road, blood coming out both ears, and the dog wouldn't let anybody near him. So they got another dog master in, and they got him out. Well, the kid had dumped the car, and he ended up down on the CN Flats, the Falls Creek Flats. And we hunted for him. God, we were there 2 hours. We got right through to Main Street looking for this kid. And we were walking back, and Chuck said, "Carry on, I got to have a whiz here." So he stood quietly in a corner, and I walked through the yard, and he was watching, and here's this kid stuck his head out behind a door watching me walk by. Well, the next thing you knew, there was a hand on him. He was in cuffs, and the next thing I knew, a couple of stars in the department arrived and scooped him, and away he went. Well, that was our arrest, so my partner was pretty upset because I didn't know enough. So down we go to the police station, and up in the detective office, they had little 6, 8 by 8 interview rooms with a glass front on them. So when we went, and the sergeant said, "Oh, young fellow, first night in the job?" "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, he's in there." He says, "Guard him and make sure nothing happens to him." How tough can this be? So there's the usual carrying on around it. And all of a sudden, two guys that were enormous. One was a Frenchman, Armand Hammond was his name, and Ray Grant, who I later worked with, who was a logger who would sooner fight than do anything else. Huge guys. They walked in plain clothes, little pork pie hat, this guy in the French accent. He says, "What does that do?" He says. I didn't know if he was a chief or who he was. And I said, "Right in here, sir." So he opened the door, and of course I'm in charge of this guy's health and welfare. The two of them walked in, filled the room, and I'm kind of watching this, and he pulls a switchblade out of his knife, out of his pocket, and goes, click, and held it up to this kid, and he said, "If that policeman dies," he says, "you will too." And I'm like, God, there goes, that was a nice career. But they walked out, and I got home that next morning, and I thought, God, I don't know if I can put up with this for 25 years, but things did settle down. And it became a lot of fun. Then they had me walking beats from Hastings to Renfrew and then Commercial Drive, and of course, middle of the night, pouring down rain. It just wasn't a lot of fun. And no radios in those days. You had to use the call boxes that would ring in every hour, and if you arrested somebody, you had to drag him to a call box to get the wagon there. It wasn't a lot of fun. And the other thing in the academy, of course, they were, obviously integrity was there, we wouldn't have been hired, but they warned you about the downfalls in policing. And of course, I found out over the 30 years, it's like living in a barrel of whiskey. Drink booze everywhere you want it and don't want it. Women, you had to be careful with, excuse me, they'd get you nothing but trouble. And then the other thing they bugged you about was, of course, all the sudden deaths you would have to go to. And it was more of a, almost a hazing thing to just sort of make you very apprehensive about these things. So they didn't mention rock and roll, so I figured that was all right. So I'm working the Hastings, way out Hastings one night, and a guy came down from Oak Ridge and put into a car. There were shorter guys, and they picked me up. And I didn't know where I was, still in those days. And we pulled into the darkest alley I think I'd ever seen, and I could see up on the right side of the car there was about a 4-story house. He said, "I'll be back." Took the keys and disappeared. So I saw the basement door open, and there's a red light in behind it. Oh, okay, this is what they tell us about. 5 minutes later, he's back. He says, "Come on in." Okay. So then I go, and it was a recreation room. It was, the guy had a nice bar set up, red lights, mood lights, etc., etc. And here, sitting on the bar stool, was a gorgeous woman. Not very, she wasn't overly clothed, let's put it that way. Skirt up to here, sitting on a bar stool with a cigarette and a drink in front of her. So, "You want a drink?" I said, "Well, why not?" So I'm sitting there wondering what the hell's going on here, and there's a knock on the door, and I thought, "Oh, well," and I put my drink down on the floor beside me, and I said, "Oh, don't worry, it's probably just the inspector." Okay. Well, it turned out this was an ex-policeman's house. He owned a cartage company at the time, and that's the way he liked his wife to dress. But it was knock your eyes off with a stick. Of course, as I mentioned, the sudden death that you get sort of hazed about, and you're kind of apprehensive about dead bodies. I'd seen a couple, I think one at Beaver Lake and one somewhere else, but you're kind of looking, and so sure enough, on a Saturday afternoon, we get a call, and I'm working with a different partner this time. He's a little 5'9", I guess, probably a Sicilian guy named Ray Corse. And he would wear the hat up on the back of his head. He's a cocky little bugger. And he worked in the skids, and that's where I was working with him that afternoon, and we got a call. It was a sudden death in the Empress Hotel, and that's not the Victoria Empress, believe me. The rooms are probably 8 or 9 or 10 feet wide, not much longer. There's single room occupancy things you read about in the Vancouver papers. And yeah, we found him dead. The maid found him. So up we go, and Ray walked in, and I'm kind of giving it this, what are we going to find here? And the old guy had died You came in the door, immediately to your right was a dresser. There was a little walkway in front of that, probably the width of a man's shoulders, the bed, and on the other side of the bed was again a little walkway. And of course, we'd called for the people to take the body away, and you always had to search the room to make sure that, you know, there was nothing of value that you would pick up and seize and give to the next of kin. Well, this old guy had died in the between the dresser and the bed, flat in his back, just went to sleep, I guess. And Ray kind of looked at me and he said, "You search the other side of the room and the bed." He says, "I'll look after this." So he got down 1 foot on either side of the guy, the body in between his legs, and he went through the dressers, and as he got lower and lower, he got down, he's almost squatting on this guy. And he says, "Oh, look at this." He says, "The old guy didn't die broke anyway." And he pulled a nice Rolex box out of the bottom drawer. He's still squatting over this guy. He opened it up. Well, it wasn't a Rolex, it was 2 coil spring snakes. Literally, he came straight up off this body. He landed on the bed, and I thought he was going out the window. And when I'd finished laughing, and of course that was great because I wasn't worried about a body anytime after that, he turned to me and he says, "If you tell anybody, I'll kill you." Would have ruined his reputation. I think he just might have shot me too. Years and years and years of those kinds of things. I ended up walking the Skid Row beat on Hastings Street. It was the center of activity in Vancouver and British Columbia. Every crook in town at any level would show up on that street once a week. I made piles of arrests. I just had a whole lot of fun. You would look after the drunks. You would arrest them for their own protection, put them in and let them sober up, and then they would leave again. Although we had drunk court at one time, and I always remember the story about actually vagrancy court. We had a Polish guy on one of the other shifts, and he was notorious for arresting these guys for vagrancy, just no money or anything. So Judge Bewley, as a matter of fact, one morning he said, I was sitting in court watching this, and he says, "Mr. Jones," or whatever he says, "do you understand what you're under arrest for?" And he says, "No, sir, I don't." He says, "What do you mean you don't know?" And he says, "Well," he says, "Officer Paulus Chuck walked up and he says, 'You're under arrest for WAG A.' He said, 'I don't know what WAG A is.'" Of course, it's the Polish accent for vagrancy. Well, Bewley threw it right then and there. I was in court day and morning and afternoon. I'd have 4 or 5 cases in the morning. We'd arrest people rolling drunks. We'd arrest thieves, arrested hookers, under vagrancy section again, and drunk rollers were the primary story. So I would be in court for 5 days a week, morning and afternoon. And anybody here doesn't know who Harry Rankin was? He was the famous Vancouver lawyer who was basically the BC Civil Liberties Union before it was invented. He was just a terror. So I'm sitting there one morning, I've got a case, and there was a vagrancy section for a woman and a hooker. And in those days you had to do various things, and of course the interview on the street afterwards was one of the things. So I started in on this story about how I'd asked her what she said and what she'd been doing, and on, and about halfway through I thought, that's not right. And I realized that was the case, the next one. I was given a conversation on that. Oh, God. So I told the judge, I said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I made a mistake. I've got another couple of cases this morning, and this is the conversation from the next case." I said, "Mr. Haney here, that's not what she said." Well, of course, Harry saw his opportunity. He jumped up. He had hobnail boots on, I think, and he was going to stomp me. And he went up one side of me and down the other, and finally, the little wee judge, who's just a milquetoast of a guy, sat up and said, "Mr. Rankin," he said, "I won't have a police officer badgered in my court like this. Sit down." Now then, officer, carry on with a proper conversation. And Harry was just sitting there fuming. The the Skid Road area it's kind of it was just a sewer now, but it was kind of a neat place. There was the people that lived down there, the old loggers and that had fallen on hard times, their pensions weren't very big, and they'd live in these single room hotels. Often the beer parlor was their recreation hall, and they'd sit there and they'd make 2 beer to last all day, a lot of them. But the others out on the street, there was a real, I don't know if community is the right word, but there was I guess it is probably, society, I guess would be a better word. And there was drug addicts, and there was hookers, and there was drunk rollers, and there was drug traffickers, and on and on and on. But everybody had their place in it, got along quite well. Anybody got out of line, I arrested them. And we all got along fine. I treated them all with the respect they expected to get and deserved. Until one night, afternoon, I guess 10 o'clock or something, I see a couple of guys down there, and they'd had a few beer, and they're raising a little hell, and I think those are the people that caused the trouble. So I looked at this guy, and I thought, So I walked up to him, and I said, and I won't use his name, but he was from Royal Oak, and I said, if you don't get your ass out of this area pretty quick, I said, I'm going to kick it, and then I'm going to put you in jail. Now get the blankety blank out of here. And he looked at me, and of course I called him by name, and he had no idea. He was off like a shot. My brother was sitting in the beer parlor 10 days later, listening to him tell the story about this great Jesus big cop that had come up to him down in Vancouver and offered to kick his rear end and put him in jail. He said, I left pretty quick. One of the local guys. So he was about the only one I think I ever ran from here. Another night I was in the Plaza Cafe at 151 East Hastings, which is the heroin capital of Canada for users. About 4 in the morning, and again some guy like the local yokel from here is in the place causing nothing but trouble. So I told him to leave, and he didn't, so the two of us got into a kind of a violent discussion rolling around on the floor, and of course there's six people in each booth, and the place is roaring. So I'm with him again, trying to get these handcuffs on him and expecting a kick in the head at any time, and nothing happened. I stood him up, and I looked, and here sitting at the end of the walkway at the alley is a great big black guy, Fay Harding. He was a professional boxer at one time who had, I guess his career had fallen away, and he was standing there watching. Nothing happened to me. And that was, you treated people right, you got treated right. So then I went up to Granville Street, into the West End, and I did several projects up there. We had a rooming house detail that you hustled all the apartment managers. You drive by in a car and you get to one level, but there's 15 floors above them. You don't know who's up there, what's going on, or anything else, but the managers knew. So we worked with them and found some good crooks. I remember one, the guy said, he said, God, we're getting a lot of people up to the penthouse. And so I watched, and of course they're all addicts coming and going. So I went back to him. I said, you check this guy's references? Oh yeah, he says, place over on Burnaby Street. Just excellent references. So I got his references, and of course what he'd done is he'd given his own phone number over on Burnaby Street to say he was the manager, so when this guy on the Harold Street phone, he was just the nicest guy he'd ever want to meet. So we got rid of him. Another one was the nightclubs on Hornby Street. They were becoming the offices, I guess, for the sort of the upscale criminal element. We'd drive by in the police car, and they would wave at us. Often they'd use all 5 fingers. Quite often they'd just use one. And that kind of irritated us, because once they were inside, they were sort of untouchable. So partner and I said, well, this isn't very good. So we went to the boss and explained this, and he said, well, go ahead. So we talked to the club managers. They wanted us around. The odd gun had been starting to show up. The bouncers loved us because of that. And the only downside now, I realize, we said, well, we can't just stand around there picking our nose. We've got to have a drink or a glass or something in our hand. I said, the bar is yours, fellas. And my liver is still quivering right now thinking about that.
Yeah.
It was a great time, but they all wanted to show us how smart they were. And she would tell us a little bit of a story, and he would tell us a little bit more of a story, and lady at the back would tell us a little bit more of a story. And in the night, we had the whole story. We had one guy, knew we were policemen, what he was thinking of. He told us that he was going to go do a B&E that night, told us where it was and what he expected to get out of it. And we went, oh, that's not, well, good luck. We saw him a week later. He couldn't figure out how he got caught. I mean, we weren't dealing with brain surgeons here. Another funny story in the West End, there was a bunch of old big-time houses, and they'd been broken up into two-room suites and that sort of thing. And one morning we got a call on Butte Street, just off Robson, about 10 o'clock in the morning, and a young fella who had been playing chess with this little guy, I guess they were friends, and he was a little concerned. He couldn't raise, he'd come over to see his friend, and he couldn't raise him. He didn't think he was out or anything. So we found a key, found a manager, and in we go. And sure enough, the old guy is dead. Now, he had died again on the floor. Why this happens, I don't know. But he was lying there, reasonably straight, but he had one arm tucked up here above his head, so the floor is right behind me. And we called the ambulance who carried the bodies away in those days. Now, the ambulance drivers had all been around forever. They were very, very good, and they knew everything. And as luck would have it, we got one of the old guys and the kid's first day on the job. So in they come, and they put the stretcher down, and the experienced guy, of course, he takes the feet, the other guy gets the head, and there's a little bit of gas build up in there, and he's, wow. So they move him onto the stretcher. Here's his hand sticking out above the handles. And the young fellow says, why do I do this? He says, bend it down over his chest. So, of course, rigor mortis had set in, and it goes snap, crackle, and pop. And he says, you're not hurting him. Just bend it down. So this thing snaps down like this, and he gets it right over his chest. He says, now get the sheet. The young fellow turns around to get the sheet, and, of course, the rigor mortis is still in there. Turns around with the sheet, just in time to see this coming back at him. Well, I'll tell you, you've all seen the Roadrunner cartoons where there's the feet are scrambling and the dust is flying and everything else. Exactly what this guy did. Out the door he's gone, and he finally stopped when he got to Butte Street. The poor young fellow whose friend is dead, he's sitting on the porch wondering what the hell's going on. There's two policemen are absolutely helpless on the couch laughing, and the other ambulance driver is just about ready. He's looking for the bathroom. He's going to wet himself. And that, one of the things that happens. Jack Wasserman, does everybody remember him, the old saloon columnist? I became pretty good friends with him when we were doing that nightclub thing. And very powerful man, very good man. I remember being with him. We'd end up at his office at the end of the night for a drink, or we'd end up down in the living room cabaret with a whole bunch of us having a drink. And he would, at 3 in the morning, he'd pick up the phone and phone a cabinet minister. And they answered, and yes, Mr. Wasserman, sir, because all people would phone him with their problems. And he would solve a lot of them. I remember for Grace McCarthy, he picked up the phone one morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, Grace, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Came to work that night, had been fixed. I mean, he was just a good guy. So I'm walking down the street with him on Hornby Street one night, and in Vancouver, they always flushed and swept the streets. Now the flushers had the sprays on the front, and they would drive down, and a point of honor with them was they never got a pedestrian. You could be on the sidewalk and you wouldn't get a drip of water. Walking down the street that night, the flusher went by, and Jack and I are both soaked right up to our knees. Well, he was just beside himself. He says, I'll look after that, don't worry about it. And he did. Years later, I'm working out in southwest Vancouver, and I was sitting with a young fellow on a stakeout at an electronics store. It's supposed to be B&E. And of course, you start telling history and everything else. I said, what did you do before you came here, Chico? And he says, I worked for the city. I said, what did you do? He said, I drove a flusher truck. And he started to laugh. And he said, he said, that a-hole Wasserman, he says, walking down the street one night, and he said, I thought, to hell with this. So he said, I got him. And the other guy, I said, interesting. Did you get much trouble with that? He said, you have no idea. And I said, I'll tell you something, pal, your troubles aren't over yet. that was me. He got a lot of crappy jobs for a while. I worked, this is not much Royal Oak stuff, but the local boy makes good, I guess. I worked some good jobs. I worked the drug squad, ran the other undercover team for 18 months. We bought everything from heroin to fur coats. Just had a great time doing that. Somebody asked me one time at that point, I said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a professional liar. Of course, you taught these young fellows how to lie to these people and get their drugs, et cetera, et cetera. Then I went to for the major crime squad. We did bank robberies, armored car robberies. We had one with a guy where they tried to execute him at Woodward's, and they were also known in Toronto, and the girlfriend had rented an apartment on Alberni Street, and we went up and nobody home, so we got the key and went in. And looking around and opened the filing cabinet, and there was his escape kit. He had a rope that would reach from about the 8th floor down to the ground. He had a gun, and I don't know what else in there. But anyway, I had the greatest urge to knock about 30 feet off that rope. But I thought, I better not do that. The only mistake, we took the gun, of course, and then we staked it out. The only mistake I made, I think I would, to this day, love to have had a TV camera looking at him, the look on his face when he opened that drawer. As we were listening to him, and he opened the drawer, and you could just hear the pregnant pause, and the next thing, he was out the door, and of course there's 3 guys with shotguns standing there looking at him. He lifted up his briefcase, which had Kevlar in it, and reached for his gun. Why they didn't shoot him, I don't know. We got his partner down the street, and they were locked away for a long time. There was an escape attempt out of maximum security with a helicopter. It was supposed to be them, but a guard had been missing that morning, and they weren't in the usual spot. Nice guys. Lots of murders, kidnappings we did. The best one, I did 2 of them in my time in there, and the best one, of course, was the day Jim Patterson's daughter got kidnapped. And of course, you don't know what you're dealing with here. So, you can get somebody killed if you make the wrong step. The bosses wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of that. They just went and hid. But they could sure second guess you afterwards. So we did the usual things. We dropped the money off at the right place. And the interesting thing is that the guy asked for the same amount of money, and unbeknownst to him, that Patterson had just got kidnap insurance for that exact same amount of money. So now he's thinking that it's his own staff or somebody that's in on this. It turned out a bunch of punks in North Vancouver. So he dropped the money in the basement of the Hudson Bay where they asked for it, and the kid picked it up and just took off at a dead run. Now our surveillance team is burned there, so we chased him and lost him. And the lady that ran the security at the Bay phoned me, and she said, what was going on here last night? So you're sworn to secrecy, but so I told her anyway. 2 hours later, they phoned, these same yokels had arrived back in a limousine, the whole gang spending the money. The night before, once we dropped the money, of course, they released her. And what a nice lady she was, young lady. She was still wearing her dressing gown, and they duct taped her eyes closed, and of course when they released her, she got that off and got into a house. And I arrived there with her husband minutes later, and I looked at her and said, nice hat. Now this woman had been tied up and everything all day, and yeah, you're Patterson's daughter. She said, you like it? That was it. I mean, what a tough woman she was. Had a bunch of extortions, of course. The best one was Joe Siegel. Very, very rich individual in Vancouver, Jewish guy. Very, very rich. And of course, he got the note and thought, what do I do? So he phoned Joe Cohen, who owned Sony, who had the connections, who phoned the chief, who phoned down, and finally ended up with me at about 8 o'clock at night. And I thought, this is not going to be good when all that heat's on it. So a couple of days later, when we were interviewing him, and he'd asked, I forget what he'd asked for, it wasn't a whole lot of money, and Joe's wife very nicely said, I don't know why he didn't just write us a letter. She says, we probably would have written him a check. And he said, what? She said, we get letters all the time. She said, and you know, I need $1,000 to finish my degree, or my baby needs milk, or all these stories. She said, we just send him a check. That's the way it was. So we got this guy, and I was sitting in Joe's waiting room out in his office in downtown Vancouver with my partner afterwards, and on the table is a coffee table book on the Hudson Bay. And my partner's looking at the book, and Joe comes out, oh, guys, come on in. And Dave put the book down. He said, I just about bought that. I said, yeah, I know. So we leave, and Dave said to me afterwards, he says, what a cheap bugger he is. He says, what, do you steal the book or what? I said, no, Dave, the company, the Hudson Bay. He had a controlling interest in Hudson Bay and the kind of money he had. Just astounding. And then there was the fun one. The kid phoned me that I knew, and he said, I got a guy who wants somebody killed. I said, okay. So we got an undercover RCMP member, and we got this kid to introduce him that he would do the killing. And what had happened is this guy was a stock promoter type, and he had a girlfriend who worked in one of the trust companies that actually print the stock certificates. So she printed up a whole bunch of, I think it was Trans-Canada Pipeline, or one of those top companies anyway. They had a stack like this. So now how do you sell them? Well, this guy was pretty sharp. He was going to send them to the Grand Cayman Islands and use them as security for a big loan. It would have worked like a charm, but how do you get to the Caymans? So a little Irishman, just like a little garden gnome, comes in and he bounces, oh, I can do that. He says, so da-da-da-da-da, and they look at each other, and so he gives them the stock, and the guy says, this will be easy. So he goes back to Toronto and he gets a young stockbroker to sell them. Well, that's what they call a certificate of encumbrance. He couldn't prove where they come from, and of course when they started looking at them, they realized they're phony stock, so it works back, and they all get arrested. So this guy is so upset he wants to kill the little Irishman. So back we went, we charged them with counseling murder. They were all charged, of course, with stock fraud. They all beat that. And the guy did 5 years for wanting somebody killed. Just a poetic justice, I guess. In those days we would walk. We had 3 shifts, and two of us would walk the beats in the skids. And then they decided that we shouldn't. They needed us somewhere else, so they pulled us off the beats, and of course they just went to hell. So now they just suddenly decide, well, they err their ways, but now they need a whole team to clean that up. And of course Bernie Smith was just a classic man to do that. But they had about 8 guys doing what 2 of us used to do. But he got lots of TV out of it, and he was a good guy. He was lots of fun, lots of good jokes. So he started swinging at this guy, and a small 1-bedroom apartment. You go in the door, you could turn right into the kitchen, or if you went past that, you'd go in the bedroom, but the living room out here, and he started chasing this guy around and around the sink area of the kitchen. And on the way by, there was a dish rack. He picked up this nice filleting knife, just happened to be in the dish rack. And got this guy, I guess. The guy bonked him with his club a couple of times, and he stabbed him again and kept running. And of course, he hit the good artery. And the faster this guy ran, the faster his heart ran, the faster the blood was leaving his body, or out of his system. And he was like the opposite of the Energizer Bunny. Stopped and died, of course. He pumped it out. And the little guy had got away, got outside, and when we showed up, he came to us. He bonked on the head with us pretty good. Later, when I retired, 3 of us started a stable, and we've been very, very lucky. We would claim a horse for $20,000, $25,000. We had the first one made $60,000 in 6 weeks for us. Somebody claimed him. Claimed a mare for 20. We made 250 with her. Sold her as a brood mare for 20. A couple others. We claimed one we never got a start out of. He had bad legs, so that was 25 out the window. And then we got this guy that I picked out of the crowd. Claimed him for 25 as a 4-year-old. We retired him when he was 11. He ran in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, Golden Gate in San Francisco, and Phoenix. He made us about $450,000. And the best part of him was that we would hear at San Francisco, for example, the trainer would phone us at 10 o'clock in the morning and say, I've entered him for 2 days from now. By noon, my partner and I are across the border and gone. Just time after time after time. It was just a great time. He won the biggest race in Vancouver for older horses worth $100,000. We got $60,000 of that, and he was just a neat professional racehorse. We've had a good time. I retired. I couldn't stop and went into started my own PI, private investigation business. Mostly asset searches for guys hiding money from their husband, or the other way around, husbands from the wives. Some of them are just so stupid you wouldn't believe it. But one guy ran up he was working offshore, and he made all his profit and kept it offshore. He ran up all his bills here. I found $1 million in the bank in China of his and $1 million in New York. Now to prove it, you had to bring the people to court, so we couldn't afford to do that. So I went and deposited $50 in each account in his name, and it was accepted. So that's not proof, but the judge heard it. She said, okay. He got stung pretty good. The funniest one, of course, was the guy was, I don't know what he's doing on the internet or where he was, but he found a woman in a dungeon. And of course it's all show and make-believe, and, dark, dirty dungeon, and she's in a cave. So he was in London, England. He wrote a letter I guess he did a lot of research, strictly research, and found out it was made in Vancouver. So he wrote a letter to the chief constable that this is absolutely disgusting, that this would go on in his fair city. So the vice squad weren't very bright in that case. They got on their white horses, they ran out to the place, and they seized everything in the place, all his computers, absolutely everything. The problem was they couldn't prove what had been shown. So they were going to, he would have beat the charges hands down. He says, no, I want to know what the contemporary community standards, or what the case was, what the criteria was. So he wanted to know. So his lawyer phoned me and brought me in and told me the story, and he said, actually there was a show called Kink at the time. I'm sure nobody here watched it. Somebody did. He says, I want you to go to these parties and see what's going on, how acceptable it is and everything else. And I thought, oh, okay. So there was one night, and it's all fetish stuff, and I didn't know what the hell to wear. So I went, so I'm like, well, I won't talk about my fetishes. But, so anyway, I went to the costume shop, and I said, the kid was kind of embarrassed, and I said, I'm going to this party. And he says, you're going to the party? He says, God, I got just the thing for you. So I walk out of there, I'm dressed like, I guess, one of Robin Hood's archers. I got the hat on, I got the pheasant feathers sticking out of here, and I'm thinking, God, I'm stupid. So my wife just killed herself laughing. Anyway, I went out the door and I walked into this place, and man, it was different. There was a dungeon in the basement, people getting flogged and all kinds of things. Dance floor upstairs, there wasn't a lot of clothing on there, and then a bar upstairs. And the funny thing was, I was kicking myself for doing it, is what I was doing. And after about 15 minutes, I thought, this is normal. Not to you and I it's normal, but it was perfectly normal to them. We went to court. We had some fun with a prosecutor who was an Irish Catholic, and he thought it was sinful, I think. A couple of pictures here. There's one much younger. We seized a whole bunch of guns from a gangster. Pass that around. He wasn't happy with us. Now you see lineups on television. I've got another lineup here. We had a group of guys in Vancouver, Levinson Brothers, Dwight Erickson, and 3 or 4 of them, and they were world-class jewel thieves. And of course, I'd sort of grown up. They started when I started, and we'd sort of grown up together. I was on Seymour Street having lunch with a friend one day in uniform. I was supposed to be away at southwest Vancouver. And I saw Dwight pull up in his Jag in this stop there, loading zone, and he's out of the car. And I said to my partners, "Oh God," I said, "Here, pay the bill. I've got to go to work." So I stood on the door and waited. He's got to come back to his car. So sure enough, he'd come bopping back in about 5 minutes, well-dressed, sport jacket, the whole thing. I said, "Dwight, come here." Oh God. And here in his pocket was about 6 watches, and they were all top end Tag Heuer and on and on. Still had the price tags on them. We were parked right outside a jewelry store, and it had bay windows on it. So he'd gone up to the corner of in the corner door, walked down the length of the place, in behind the counter, up to the front window, bay window where these things were stuck, put them in his pocket, walked back out, and the people in the store, "Oh, please, what are they doing?" Of course, they still had the price. They didn't know they were gone. Nobody saw them. They were good. They were very, very good. They had a hands. I remember sitting in one of the clubs one night. We had a couple of dollars in change on the table, and this guy was so drunk he couldn't talk. And I saw the flower girl coming, so I picked up my bills. And he reached down and he picked that off the counter like that. I can't pick it up like that. He had the whole works in his hand. They were just brilliant. So I said, "This is not your day." And he said, "No, and it's going to get worse." There was another place out in the Arbutus Gardens, jewelry store, bay windows, black velvet cloth, loose diamonds, all various sizes in here. So on the weekend, these guys had gone and picked the putty or whatever it was out from between the windows, and they had a stick with gum on the end, a chewing gum on the end. And the guy put them out on Monday morning, and these guys sort of hung around the store, and they reached in and went, one was too big to get out. Instead of trying to pry the window, they just left it. We'll get more. And of course, poor old Dwight had these stones in an envelope. He just had them appraised from a jeweler that they dealt with. But what he didn't know is those diamonds had all been spectrographed, and that's where they shine a light through them, and they come up with various rainbow colors or whatever they do. They could all be identified, and of course these could all be identified. That's the lineup that I put him in. He's number 13. I don't know, it wasn't his lucky number. This guy, number 4, he was a serial bank robber that we got. I think we caught him for about 10 banks. The funny thing is, too, when we did lineups, we would, usually about 6 o'clock at night we'd do them because the people were working and they would come down and we had the find people that fit the bad guy description, height and age and maybe a mustache or a beard. So we'd walk through the beer parlors, the local beer parlors. And of course, 6 o'clock, these guys would look at us and they said, "I'll go." And I said, no mustache. We don't, no mustaches. "I'll go home and shave." We gave them $20 to appear in a lineup. They were just as happy as clams to appear for us. Once they realized that they got picked out, we knew it was the wrong guy. That was good. Just one other picture I was going to show you anyway. You probably wouldn't want to look at it. It's an autopsy. The only interesting thing about it was the guy had been machine gunned, and his partner was in the other operating room, and this surgeon was by himself, and I was in looking for bullets out of the body, and he had gloves on me, and I was holding this and plugging that hole and everything else. And he was the only one that ever came down to check and see his diagnosis was right the next morning. So, not a lot of Royal Oak fun, but...
Do you ever get used to it?
Oh, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, no, it's just part of the job.
Your job?
Yeah. It was fascinating.
Well, it's been wonderful hearing about it.
Well,
I'm glad you were doing it.
Not a lot of royal oak, but I've had a lot of fun.